In June 1348, a single man staggered onto the docks of Melcombe Regis. And within days, the bells began to ring without pause. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Not because death had ended, but because there was no one left to pull the ropes. What kind of world falls silent, not from peace, but from absence? Before we step into this story, tell me where you're watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Because what you're about to witness is not just death, but the collapse of reality itself. The man who arrived at Melcombe Regis was barely noticed. Just another exhausted sailor returning from distant trade routes. But by nightfall, fever consumed him. And by morning, dark swellings bloomed across his body like omens no one could yet understand. Within a week, the harbor master was dead, followed by the innkeeper, the clerk, an entire household swallowed in silence as the infection crept through narrow streets like water through stone. In Bristol, the transformation was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. A woman awoke beside her husband's lifeless body, her cries echoing through a city that no longer answered. Markets that once roared with bargaining voices stood abandoned, and High Street, once the artery of commerce, began to grow over with grass, thick and undisturbed. The soundscape of medieval life collapsed into something far more terrifying than chaos: total stillness. In London, the horror took on a more intimate shape. A father watched his daughter struggle for breath, blood marking her lips as the mnemonic form of the disease spread with terrifying speed. He understood what it meant. He had seen it too many times already. And yet, instead of holding her, he stepped back. Then he turned, and he ran. In that moment, something deeper than society began to fracture. This was not merely a plague. It was the unraveling of human instinct itself, where survival demanded betrayal, and love became a liability. And as the disease advanced, England was not just losing lives. It was losing the invisible threads that held it together. Before the plague, England was not a broken land. It was a system of remarkable precision. Its population had swelled to nearly 4 million. Cities pulsed with trade, and towering cathedrals pierced the skyline as symbols of divine order. The feudal structure, though unequal, functioned like a machine. Lords owned the land, peasants worked it, and the harvest sustained all. It was rigid, predictable, and above all, stable. But beneath that stability, cracks had already begun to form. The end of the medieval warm period shortened growing seasons. And between 1315 and 1317, the Great Famine swept across Europe, leaving behind a population weakened by hunger and desperation. Cities grew denser, filth accumulated in streets that doubled as sewers, and homes packed families alongside livestock in conditions ripe for catastrophe. England was not prepared. It was primed. When the Black Death arrived, it did not strike a healthy system. It struck one already on the brink. Villages that once thrived with routine labor fell into eerie abandonment. Fields went unharvested, crops rotted where they stood, and livestock wandered without direction, their caretakers long gone. The carefully managed landscape, shaped by generations, began to dissolve back into wilderness. And with each passing day, it became clear that this was not a temporary disruption. The machine had not slowed. It had broken. Not through rebellion, not through war, but through absence. Too few hands remained to sustain a system built on abundance. What no one yet realized was that this destruction was not the end of the system, but the beginning of something entirely new. For medieval England, the plague did more than attack the body. It attacked the meaning of existence. The Church had long provided the grammar of suffering. Every fast, feast, burial, and blessing fit within a sacred order that explained why people lived and died. But when the Black Death began killing priests almost as quickly as peasants, that order started to fail in full view of the people who depended on it most. Parishes were left without curates. The dying called for confession and found no one coming. Last rites, the final shield between a Christian soul and eternal uncertainty, were suddenly unavailable in village after village. In January 1349, the Bishop of Bath and Wells authorized an extraordinary concession. Lay people, even women, could hear confession and grant absolution when no priest could be found. In ordinary times, such an act would have been unimaginable. In plague time, necessity shattered doctrine. That decision revealed something terrifying. Salvation, once guarded by a powerful institution, now seemed to rest in desperate improvisation. If priests died, if prayers failed, if processions changed nothing, then what exactly had divine order protected? Across Europe, bands of flagellants marched from town to town, stripping to the waist and lashing themselves with iron-tipped scourges, convinced that only blood and public suffering could reconcile humanity with a wrathful God. And when fear demanded an explanation, many reached for cruelty. Rumors spread that poisoned wells and hidden conspirators were to blame. Old hatreds flared into massacres. The plague exposed not only biological weakness, but moral collapse. England was learning that when the sacred canopy tears, people do not simply lose faith. They become capable of almost anything. By the time the first great wave burned through England, the numbers had become almost too large for the mind to carry. Between 40 and 60% of the population, perhaps 2.5 million people, were gone within roughly 18 months. This was not a bad season, not a local famine, not even a devastating war. It was demographic ruin on a scale that made the old world mathematically impossible to restore. In London, the crisis became brutally visible. The city may have held around 75,000 people before the plague arrived. Packed tightly inside its walls, dense with trade, noise, smoke, and refuse. Once infection took hold in late 1348, death accelerated through the winter and into the spring of 1349. At the peak, roughly 200 people were dying each day. Parish graveyards, designed for ordinary mortality, collapsed under extraordinary loss. At first, the dead were buried with care. Bodies were laid in rows, clothed, placed as Christians should be, as if dignity itself might resist the panic. But dignity requires time, labor, and strength. And the plague consumed all three. Soon, emergency burial grounds at Smithfield and East Smithfield were opened. Trenches were cut into the earth, and corpses were stacked 5 deep, layer upon layer, like split wood prepared for winter fires. The horror was not only visual. It was sensory, total, unforgettable. The smell of decay drifted over entire neighborhoods. Streets became corridors of avoidance. Houses sealed themselves in fear. The living moved among the dead as though already rehearsing their own disappearance. And here, at the center of the catastrophe, England confronted a truth more terrifying than disease itself. That an entire civilization could be brought to its knees not by invasion, but by subtraction. When the plague finally loosened its grip, the silence it left behind was not empty. It was charged with possibility. England had lost nearly half its people, and yet, for those who survived, the rules that had governed life for centuries no longer applied. The old balance between land and labor had inverted. Where once there had been too many workers and too little opportunity, now there was land everywhere, and not enough hands to claim it. Peasants who had spent their entire lives bound to a single lord's estate began to move, quietly at first, then openly. They sought better wages, lighter obligations, more favorable terms. And for the first time in generations, they found them. A laborer who once earned 2 pennies a day could now demand 6. Women, too, saw their economic value rise sharply, their labor no longer easily replaced. Survival had become leverage. Lords, desperate to restore production, were forced into a position that would have seemed unthinkable before 1348. They negotiated. They offered wages instead of demanding service. They competed for workers who now understood their own scarcity. The feudal system, once rigid and unquestioned, began to bend under the weight of demographic reality. The ruling class fought back. In 1349, the Ordinance of Laborers attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict mobility. 2 years later, the Statute of Laborers reinforced these controls, mandating work and punishing those who refused. But laws cannot reverse arithmetic. Too many were gone. Too much had changed. Even the land itself adapted. Vast grain fields, once labor-intensive, were abandoned or converted into pasture. Sheep replaced crops, wool replaced wheat. This shift, from corn to horn, reduced the need for labor while feeding a growing textile economy. Villages disappeared, enclosed into grazing land, while survivors clustered in more viable settlements. Out of devastation emerged something deeply unsettling. A form of freedom born not from ideology, but from absence. England was no longer the same society. It had been recalculated. The Black Death did not end in 1351. It echoed. New waves returned in 1361, 1369, and again for generations, ensuring that the memory of mass death never fully faded. But the England that endured these cycles was no longer medieval in the way it had once been. Something fundamental had shifted. Not just in population, but in perception. Survivors were, in many cases, physically stronger than those who had come before. The plague had disproportionately taken the malnourished and the vulnerable, leaving behind a population that, combined with greater access to resources, experienced improved health and living standards over time. Wages remained higher, diets improved. The average person, though scarred by loss, lived better than their ancestors had in the overcrowded decades before 1348. But the deeper transformation was psychological. Art became obsessed with death. Skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike, reminding all that status meant nothing in the face of mortality. The certainty that had once defined medieval life, the belief in a stable, God-ordered universe, fractured. People had seen too much. Prayers had failed. Institutions had collapsed. And in that vacuum, new ways of thinking began to emerge. Local governance strengthened as centralized authority faltered. The English language gained ground among clergy and administration, replacing Latin in many contexts. Serfdom, though not abolished overnight, began its slow decline as mobility and wage labor became more common. These were not reforms planned in council chambers. They were adaptations forced by catastrophe. This was the true legacy of the Black Death. Not just a reduction in population, but an ontological rupture, a break in how people understood reality itself. England did not rebuild what it had lost. It became something else entirely. If this story changed the way you see history, share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from, and what moment stayed with you the most? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can uncover the hidden forces that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and wherever you are, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story.